Okay, so I want to talk through in a lot more detail exactly how we can send information from host A over here to host B over here. This process is really important, so I want to get really detailed and walk through this step by step. So in the last video, we talked about how we can't just send the Ethernet frame from host A with host B's MAC address as the destination. So we can't just say our destination MAC is going to be, we'll just use the last bit here, 86 AD. We can't just send it to this destination MAC address because then it's only going to be sent on this Ethernet here from host A, and it's only going to be seen by these computers that are connected here. It's not going to get forwarded over here. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to use IP addresses. So the destination IP address is going to be host B's IP address, which is 192.168.20.2. And then we can also set the source address of the frame of the IP packet that host A is sending to be 192.168.9.2, which is host A's IP address. And then the actual frame that gets sent here is going to have this IP packet inside it with this source and destination IP address going from 9.2 to 20.2. But the IP packet is going to be inside of an Ethernet frame because this is still an Ethernet network. So we still need to have a source and destination MAC address in our Ethernet header. Remember, if we look at our Ethernet frame format, we've got the preamble, and then we have this destination address, source address. And this destination and source address, these are Ethernet addresses. And then the ether type will tell us that the payload is an IP packet. And so the IP addresses are going to be somewhere in this payload. But we still need to figure out what these are. So the source address is pretty simple. We're sending from host A, so it's going to be host A's MAC address, which ends with the 2C2D. So the source address here is going to be 2C2D, and whatever comes before that. But the destination, we can't use host B's. We have to use something on this network. So the sort of obvious choice is we want the San Francisco router here to forward it, so we should use San Francisco's MAC address as the destination. And in fact, that's what we do. So the destination address is going to be this AE95. So this is going to be AE95. But the question is, how does that actually get set? How does host A know that San Francisco is the right place to send this Ethernet frame? So to understand this a little bit better, let's take a look at how host A is actually configured. And so I've set my computer up in the same way. And so here are the settings in my computer here. And so this is for my Ethernet link on my computer. So my IP address is set to 192.168.9.2. So that's the same as host A here. And then there's two other things that you set when you set up an IP address on a computer, and that is a subnet mask, which in this case is 255.255.255.0. And what this essentially is saying is this is kind of telling us what prefix of IP addresses is shared by this Ethernet network. And the way it tells us that is that if we convert this to binary, 255, if you convert 255 to binary, it's just a string of ones. It's 8 ones. And so if we have 3 of these strings of 8 ones together, that's 24 ones followed by some zeros. So if we convert this whole thing to binary, we get 24 ones followed by 8 zeros. And the 24 ones is the key part there. Because what this is saying is this is basically saying the same thing as if we had a prefix, if you remember from the last video, of 192.168.9 with a prefix length of 24. So if we go back here, this subnet mask with 24 ones is just another way of saying that the prefix length is a /24. And so what this says is that everything connected to this Ethernet network has this prefix IP address of 192.168.9. something. So that's great. So we know from host A, if we want to go to 192.168.9. something, then it's going to be connected to this Ethernet network that we're directly connected to. But what if we want to go somewhere else? What if we want to go to 192.168.20.2, for example? So for anything else, we have this router IP address configured, which is 192.168.9.1, and that is the IP address of this San Francisco router's interface. And so what this is saying is if it's not on this subnet, if it's not 192.168.9. something that matches this IP and this prefix, then send it to this router. So again, that's great, but how do we actually send it to that router? We have the IP address. We know that we want to send it to this 9.1, but we need to know how to get it to that MAC address. And so there's actually a specific protocol that you can use to send a broadcast to everybody on the Ethernet network asking who owns this IP address. So I could send from host A, I could send a broadcast saying like, hey, everybody on this Ethernet network, if any of you are the owner of 9.1, respond to me and tell me what your MAC address is. And the protocol that we use to do that is called Address Resolution Protocol. And this down here is the actual format of that Address Resolution Protocol. And so what we would actually send from host A to find out the MAC address of the San Francisco router is we'd send an Ethernet frame to a broadcast address. So the destination address of this Ethernet frame is going to be the broadcast address, which is just all Fs, or all ones if you convert to binary. The source address then is going to be the source address of computer A, which is this whatever 2C 2D. And I'm just going to abbreviate that so I don't have to write the whole thing out. Then the ether type is going to be the ether type that, the ether type again describes what is in the payload. And so what's in the payload is this ARP request. And so the payload is actually going to be this whole thing here. So if we look at what's in the payload, that's this. And this whole thing is called ARP, which is the Address Resolution Protocol. And so the ether type here is going to tell us that the payload is this format. And so there's a special code for that, which is 0806. And so when we see this 0806, then we know that the payload is going to be this ARP format. And so there's a bunch of things in this ARP frame, and I'll go through them kind of quickly because it's actually not that complicated. So what ARP is doing is it's this protocol that lets us do a mapping between hardware addresses and protocol addresses. And so the hardware address is the MAC address for Ethernet, and the protocol address is the IP address. And so the first thing that we say in the ARP frame is we tell it the types of hardware address and protocol address. And so this is almost always going to be, the hardware address is almost always going to be 1, which means Ethernet, and the protocol address is always going to be 0800, which means IP. And so we're going to map between Ethernet and IP. And then the hardware address length is just the length of the hardware address, and for Ethernet it is always going to be 6 bytes. And the protocol address length is the length of the address for IP, and for IP that's always going to be 4 bytes. So these things are always these values here. The next thing is the opcode, and this is going to be either 1 or 2, and 1 means that this is a broadcasted question that's being broadcast to the entire Ethernet network asking who owns a particular IP address. And then 2 is the reply from someone saying, I own that particular address, and here's my MAC address. And so the hardware address of the sender is going to be whoever's sending the packet. So there's actually going to be 2 of these ARP frames being sent. One that's being sent from host A. So the hardware address of the sender is going to be host A. And then the protocol address of the sender is going to be 192.168.9.2. And then the hardware address of the target is actually going to start out being all zeros because host A doesn't know the address yet. And then the protocol address of the target is going to be 192.168.9.1. And so by filling all of this out, host A can ask everyone on the network and say, hey, whoever has 192.168.9.1, please respond and fill in your hardware address. And by the way, I'm 192.168.9.2. And my address is whatever, 2C2D. And so this is being broadcast to everyone on the network because the Ethernet destination is this all Fs or all ones broadcast address. And so the San Francisco router is going to see this and it's going to reply. And it's going to basically send another one of these, except it's going to send opcode 2, and it's just going to swap these. So in this case, when San Francisco replies, its hardware address is going to be filled in. Its protocol address, in this case, is going to be 9.1. The hardware address of the target, now it knows, is this. It'll fill that in. It'll fill in the protocol address of the target is 2, and so that'll be the reply. And so once we're done with that whole process, host A has been able to figure out the appropriate destination MAC address that it's going to send its Ethernet frames to that contain the IP packet that are going to this destination of 20.2.